anymore. Please do feel free to interrupt me if you need to throughout the session with a question if you've got it. I think Sean's going to watch the chat just in case I get distracted. And I really do enjoy having this be more of a dialogue than just me yelling at you, especially as I'm yelling into my laptop now. All right, so let's get started. So, oh, real quick, are you guys seeing my Zoom box here, or is do you only see the screen? Let me know if you see this. Do you see the Zoom box, the little screen that I'm looking at? Nope, all clear. Fantastic. Okay. So the earliest evidence that we have of practice is trepanation. Now, trepanation is what we're seeing right here. It is making a hole in the skull. So you can see the person on the left here didn't quite make it, but surprisingly, many people throughout ancient history did actually have trepanation and survive. Somebody shout out into the chat why we know the person on the right here survived their trepanation, having a hole burred or shaved into their skull through the skull bones. There's something about the one on the right that's different from the one on the left. Curved bone edges. Yeah, they're smooth. You can see here, this probably killed the person at the time because those edges showed no evidence of healing, whereas here, nice and smooth. There are animals from Central and South America that have multiple trepanation holes in them that were healed. So this was a practice that was actually brought to a fairly high degree of sophistication, but the reason for it has nothing to do with the modern practice of trepanation. Today, trepanation is done to access the brain, to decompress it if you've got encephalitis, or to remove a hematoma that may have settled around the outside of the brain. In these days, best to guess is this was done as a way of curing spiritual or mental illness and helping people actually get the bad spirits out of their head, because people have known for a while that if you have a head injury, you may actually have some sort of derangement of your behavior thereafter, and this was seen as a way to deal with that. So very early on, spiritual concerns and medicine were very tightly linked together, and it's not till quite a bit later that that actually happens. Let's see. And now we should be looking at the next thing. If you have any fond memories of this game, Operation, as a kid, I really wish this existed. I think it's just a gag, but if anyone ever finds trepanation, this game, I want a copy of it as quickly as humanly possible. All right. So one thing that we know is that the ancient Peruvians had practice going on of trepanation, and trepanation, they got better at it over time because skulls from much earlier in the history had a lot of fatal appearing skulls that didn't have any evidence of healing, but much later, towards the time of the Spanish conquest, they were actually getting quite good at this and being able to do these operations and have people survive. But that spiritual connection between illness and treatment was very strong. In fact, ancient medicine in the Americas, one thing that was done was they would have guinea pigs that would be held over the affected area of a person. Then those guinea pigs were sacrificed, and the organs were looked at as a way of figuring out what might be wrong. It was seen as a way to guide further treatment. So sacrifice to actually figure out how to treat was happening there. And it also happened in the ancient Middle East, in the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Disease was thought to be supernatural in origin. And there were actually religious priestly healers, but also secular healers. But the assumption was that disease was caused by demonic influence, family curses, things of that nature. And we have evidence that they sacrificed animals as a way of figuring out how to proceed through treatment. This stone right here is actually a liver. Now, hopefully not everyone's still on this page. Early on in this whole Zoom/Teams experience, it wouldn't actually track with everyone else. So I hope everyone's looking at the Hanging Gardens of Babylon on the right and the liver down here on the left. Somebody give me a quick yes in the chat if that's true, and I'll stop worrying about it. But this liver is marked with many different symbols that were used as a guide for treatment. So if they sacrificed an animal and its liver had any sort of malformation, tumor, bleeding in one of these areas, it was seen as a way for them to figure out how to proceed with the treatment of the person who was involved. So that is a practice from ancient Mesopotamia. Another famous Babylonian king was, or a famous Babylonian king was Hammurabi. Now, he set down a code of laws that are considered to be fairly draconian, fairly rough, fairly unforgiving. But the thing that was really a big improvement over previous kingships is that they were actually rules that pertained to everyone. And so, in fact, and yes, in the chat, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were one of the 7 wonders of the world. But Hammurabi actually had rules in his code of laws pertaining to physicians. And just in case you guys think malpractice these days is bad, which it is, it could actually be worse. So just take a look here. If a doctor has treated a free man with a metal knife for a severe wound and has cured that free man, or opened his tumor with a metal knife, cured his eye, he shall receive 10 shekels of silver. So far, so good. But if that same doctor has treated a free man with a metal knife, caused the man to die, or has destroyed the man's eye, his hands shall be cut off. So thankfully, that's not part of our malpractice world at this time. But that's some evidence we have of medicine from earliest stages. Now, yeah, I agree, no pressure. At this point, we can shift over to Egypt. Now, the Egyptian Empire was incredibly long-lived, and the practice of mummification is really interesting in that it involves practically dealing with the anatomy, but not for medical reasons, for spiritual reasons, for preserving someone and getting them ready for the afterlife. So the brain was removed, and it was removed with a relatively thin wire. And people have tried to work this the way it's been classically said, where they kind of hook in and try to remove the brain. What Ron Wade, an expert on embalming and Egyptology, has said is that he thinks they just put it in there and swished it around to sort of liquefy the brain and let it drain out the whole. But all the organs, except for the heart, were placed in these canopic jars with various Egyptian gods on them. Those jars were then put back into the body, and the heart was left in place as the kind of king or seat of all function of the organs. But here's the thing that blows my mind. While these priests were doing all this embalming and Egyptian work and work with mummification, somebody's not mute, that was interesting, we have almost no transfer of that over to their medical practice. The two practices were seen as completely separate. So people were not using this as a way of informing their medical treatment. And they had a lot of medical treatment that's preserved in papyrus. Now, because Egypt is dry and desert-like, a lot of the papyrus, which is basically reed-based pseudo paper, survived. And we have various things like the Edward Smith papyrus, the Ebers papyrus, that tell us about how Egyptian medicine worked. So disease was thought to be a result of bad food. And bad food would rot inside your gut, and it would flux, F-L-U-X, and would flux through your blood and then create tumors or sores or wounds on your body that would grow. And it was thought that you needed to, one, remove the bad food, and then try to remove those flux particles. And this was done by trying to remove stuff from the body by bleeding or enemas, purgatives, massage, things to just get stuff moving, to get that fluxed, purulent, nasty stuff out of your body. Now, the Egyptians also had a pretty significant pharmacy. They were able to actually record many herbal medical treatments, and those were laid down in these papyri. As for the efficacy of these things, probably not great, but they were actively researching and gathering different pharmacologic interventions at a very early stage, largely based around plant life, herbs, and so forth. So the Egyptians also had a method of learning how disease started by, quote unquote, incubating people in temples. People would go to a temple dedicated to Imhotep. For any fans of the Mummy franchise from way back in the 90s, Imhotep was actually considered to be a real person before becoming a kind of part of the Egyptian pantheon of gods. But these temples were places people would go, and they would rest in the temple. The priests would, observe them, see how they were progressing, and then they would have a therapeutic dream that would let the priest know how this person should then change their life to fix themselves. Now, one thing about this temple-based healing is you've taken sick people and put them in a secluded relatively sanitary place and let them rest, chances are good a lot of them are going to get better. And so this was actually a very nice way to just give people a place to heal, even if there wasn't any actual temple effect on that person themselves. One interesting thing that happened as a result of this is that Greek mercenaries who were in Egypt at the time saw this practice and brought it back home with them when they returned to Greece. And instead of Imhotep, these temples were associated with Asclepius or Aesculapius, depending on how you want to pronounce that. The temples were very much the same as the temples of Imhotep in that they were places people would go to heal. And these temples tended to be in mountainous areas, lots of fresh air, lots of fresh water, people hanging out, trying to see to the welfare of the patients. So not surprisingly, a lot of people actually improved in these places. There were also many snakes kept in the Asclepian temples. And this is a point in the chat. I want somebody to tell me why it's actually a good thing to have lots and lots of snakes in a hospital/temple area. Maybe not these days. You can't just have snakes roaming around our hospital. But why was this a good thing back in the day? And I should mention, these were non-venomous snakes. Ooh, there we go. No mice, no rats, no rodents. Exactly. They kept vermin down. Now, there's another thing that snakes do that's also relatively symbolic of what's happening at these temples, and that's that they shed their skin. So they were seen as an omen of health and that they would take care of the vermin, but they would also shed their skin, much as a sick patient would shed their illness and go back to productive life. Now, one quick aside, the caduceus right here with two snakes is not the symbol of Asclepius. That is the symbol of Mercury, god of commerce, money, and many other things. And the Asclepian staff is a single snake wound around a piece of wood. And not to get take too many sides here on the team, but you will notice that the osteopathic actually has the staff of Asclepius rather than the allopathic MD symbol, which is the staff, the caduceus of Mercury. So just a little bit of a boost for all of our DO people here. All right. Couple legends of Asclepius. Now, he was theorized to have been a real person at one point, or he might have been completely mythologized, or he could just be Imhotep imported into Greece. But the mythology related to Asclepius is that he was born to Apollo, an immortal woman, and he was taught healing by his father and a centaur. Centaur is a half man, half horse, and his name was Chiron. And he actually was able to surpass both his father and Chiron as a healer. And this made Zeus very nervous because he was not only healing people, he was getting so good he could actually bring them back to life after they died. So Zeus did what Zeus does and blasted him with some lightning and later revived him as a full Greek god, and he joined the pantheon of Greek gods at that time. And just in case anyone hasn't actually read through the thing here, I just want to note the main punchline. Chiron, being half horse, half human, and doctor mate, was the centaur for disease control. There we go. Now, Asclepius mythologically had several sons and daughters. Two of them I want to draw attention to in particular, Hygeia and Panacea. Now, Hygeia, where we get the word hygiene, was the goddess of what we would call preventative medicine, public welfare, preventing disease, good hygiene, maintenance of balance of the body. And you'll notice the statue of her, she has a snake. Very good. And one of the other daughters was Panacea, the goddess of treatment, of knowledge of all ways to deal with disease in an interventional way. So remedies, intervention and treatment of disease, and dealing with the balance of the body when it is lost. So the idea of interventional disease, interventional medicine versus preventative medicine was already present back in ancient Greek times. I just think that's fascinating. Now, at this point, we have to do a quick little veer off to the side because we're going to talk about the three classic, not because they had much to do with medicine, which they really didn't, but because their theories informed a lot of the medicine that would happen thereafter in the medieval, Renaissance, and even Enlightenment eras. So real quick gloss, and I mean extremely quick gloss on their philosophies. Socrates in roughly 400 BC was basically asking his fellow Athenians to check their assumptions, put their foundation and their assumptions on more solid ground, and basically made himself very unpopular by forcing people to deal with their own contradictions and their own hypocrisy. His student Plato opened up his own school and actually started teaching that real life is related to an ideal world of forms, and that there's an ideal version of everything, and that those concepts can be used to make the real world more like that perfect version of forms, even though we can't quite reach it because of the imperfection of the material in the world in which we live. Plato's student Aristotle, who incidentally taught Alexander the Great, so a nice little chain there, Aristotle saw things completely differently than his teacher and grounded his investigations in the real physical world and classified and studied material things rather than mathematic Platonic ideals. Although I will say Aristotle didn't do as much investigation as one might think. He did a lot of theorizing, which made him say some pretty strange things about the animals and people's anatomy that he would work on. Now, one thing that's important about that is that there was a cultural norm at the time that's been plaguing us to this day, and that is the idea that manual labor and actually doing things with your hands was subservient and inferior to mental activity. So in those days, and possibly much later, we have people basically implying that if you're doing mental work, you are somehow superior to people doing manual work, and that this theorizing has more importance than practical application. And I'll go on record right away as saying I think that's garbage, but we are stuck with it as a cultural legacy of the Greeks. Real quick aside, Raphael of Urbino painted the School of Athens in the Vatican, and right front and center there we have Plato and Aristotle. Plato pointing upward at the ideals, Aristotle focusing down at the world as it's grounded. And a quick nerd aside here, the model for Plato over here was Leonardo da Vinci, and I think we've got Raphael himself. I don't know if this is an artist insert or not, but this guy down here hanging out by himself looking depressed is Michelangelo Buonarroti. So just a little fun for any art nerds in the house. Question, do you know which of these men created the philosophy of the three levels of the soul? I do not, so I'll have to kind of table that one a little bit later. Now, the big name, jumping back to actual medical history in ancient Greece, is Hippocrates of Cos, an island on the southern side of Greece, and he is really thought of to be the father of Western medicine, in that he divorced medicine from spirituality. Now, that's not to say that there are not spiritual things that influence people's ability to be healthy, but he divorced medicine from spirituality in the sense of he did not believe that there were spiritual causes and spiritual treatments for disease. He felt that they were physical actions that could be taken to actually help people get better, and that the cause of disease could be identified and taken care of by close observation and timely intervention. Now, that sounds fantastic in terms of actually working to do research. He came up with a theory of health, which is by modern standards completely ridiculous. But at the same time, working with what he had, I don't think many of us could come up with anything better. So his idea about how health operated is that people have four humors in their body at various levels all the time. First of these is blood, and if you've got a lot of blood, you're very sanguine, you're happy, you're energetic, you're good to go. Blood is equated with air in the elemental theory of how these things are connected, and that gives you energy. Yellow bile was thought to be equated to fire, and it was angry, and if you were bilious, you had a lot of yellow bile, you were angry. Black bile, melos coli, or melancholy, makes you sad and kind of slow and lethargic. But the most lethargic is phlegm, the fourth humor. Water. Phlegm equates to the element water. It makes you slow and phlegmatic. These words, phlegmatic, melancholy, bilious, and sanguine, don't get them a lot of play these days, but they used to be very common ways to describe people's personality. And it comes from the fact that people thought, well, that person's just got a little excess of blood naturally. They're just very happy-go-lucky, etc. Now, the manifestations of the four humors and their connections to the four elements of Greek philosophy are really fascinating, and we'll run through this quick, although I think it's amazing. So we can place these humors and their elements on opposite sides of a graph. Hot is the opposite of cold, dry is the opposite of wet. No surprise there. If we connect those, blood and air was considered to be hot and wet. So if you had that, that was equating to blood. Yellow bile was thought to be dry and hot. Black bile was thought to be dry and cold. And no shock, phlegm was thought to be cold and wet. And it's making me a little grossed out just to say those words. So one thing about this, though, what do you call it? And put this in the chat. This is a real quick one. What's it called when you've got a lot of phlegm coming out your nose? You got a viral infection, you feel a little down, but you don't have the influenza. You've got a, I'm just going to self-insert the right answer because you guys would normally be yelling it out if you were in person. You've got a cold. And what did your mom or grandma or dad tell you not to do to not get a cold? You shouldn't go outside when it is cold and wet. So these humoral treatments of how things work are a little more persistent than people might believe. So yeah, there's nothing about going outside in the cold when it's raining that's going to make you more prone to picking up a virus, but it is still thought that doing that is going to make you more prone to getting a cold and having a lot of phlegm coming out your nose. So here's some nice artist renderings of a sanguine person looking happy. There's black bile, I guess that's sad. There's phlegmatic, kind of cold, a little slovenly, and finally bilious or angry right up there. So the four humors were not only circulating in your body, the relative balance of them led to personality and could lead to disease. So how do you treat the four humors? Modifications of the existing Egyptian methods. I don't think it was a direct transfer, but there weren't too many interventions available to people at the time. So bleeding, purging, enemas, cupping was actually employed by the ancient Greeks, where they would, put a hot cup on someone's back to raise a blister. Herbs, sweating, changing diet and massage were also involved. The Greeks actually had what I'm going to refer to as a very interesting looking manipulation table here to help straighten out twisted backs and things of that nature. So there was some manipulation and massage as part of the Hippocratic treatment to restore people's humors. Now, jumping a little further ahead into the kind of later Hellenistic and early Roman period, the library at Alexandria is a fairly well-known place where books and various knowledge was held and transmitted to people, but there were a lot of researchers present in Alexandria as well. Two of them are known to have been anatomists who did human dissection and were even rumored to have done human vivisection, which is gross, but that is the rumor that may have happened. And that was Herophilus and Erasistratus. Now, Herophilus was known to have tied the idea of the pulse of the vessels to the actual heartbeat. And he connected anatomy to disease, but we only know of his works through what other people have passed down. We don't have any examples of what he actually wrote, because as some of you may have known, spoiler alert, for something that happened thousands of years ago, the library was burned down. Erasistratus developed a theory that was to be incredibly long-lived, considering its kind of wacky nature when we think about it in the modern sense. That was the pneumatic theory. So in this theory, veins carry blood, but arteries carry vital spirit, which is going to be transformed into something called animal spirit within the ventricles of the heart, and that's what goes to muscles through nerves. Now, quick aside, nerves were thought to be hollow, and that when a muscle contracts, and if you just feel your bicep right now and contract it strongly, they thought that it getting kind of a little more rigid and expanding was because it was actually being pumped up with this animal spirit. It was actually like it was being inflated with a pump. So that animal spirit went into the muscle, blew it up through those hollow nerves, and then when it relaxed, that spirit flowed back somewhere else. That was the basics of pneumatic theory. Now, pneumatic theory was adopted with a vengeance by the next big name in Western ancient medicine, Galen of Pergamon. Now, this was Pergamon was a Greek settlement in what's modern-day Turkey. So basically the western shore of Turkey is where Pergamum is. He was born, and his father was told he would either be a great lawmaker or a great doctor. His father wanted to be a lawmaker, but Galen went for doctoring in a big way. He saw that the Hippocratic teachings had become very muddied with other people's additions to them, a lot of confusion about what actually constituted the original Hippocratic corpus or body of works, and he decided to reform it and to do so with extensive research, particularly on anatomy. And he started as a gladiatorial physician, and he was actually tending to the gladiators, looking at the wounds. And at a time where you weren't allowed to dissect a human being, this is as close as you could really get to getting a view of the function of the organs in a living person, and actually seeing them move as you were repairing, or at least treating, the wounds that gladiators were dealing to each other. He got very famous for his demonstrations. He was very arrogant and not shy about putting his theories and his ideas forward, and it worked. He became a physician to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and amongst his research, he would look at how nerves controlled muscle. He figured out that if you cut a nerve, any muscles downstream, they suddenly become paralyzed. His contribution was not only to do that research, but to tie it to pneumatic theory and come up with a very comprehensive system that encompassed physiology, anatomy, treatment of all these things. And it was comprehensive, it was authoritative, and people believed it. And the problem with that is they believed it for a very long time, and this system included many factual errors that Galen either didn't spot or didn't realize were of his limited exposure to actual human anatomy. Oops. Keep going here. So if I could pick one thing I like about Galen, it's that he did a lot of research to try to reform and standardize medical treatment and research into the human body. But the thing he did that was really detrimental to further development of scientific medicine, which we're operating with now, is that he said basically that if you studied what he had written, you did not need to do any research of your own, because obviously he had done such a comprehensive and complete and 100% authoritative job that nobody was going to surpass him, and it was pointless to even try. And the quote that he has to that effect is, "Whoever seeks fame by deeds, not alone by learned speech, he'd only become familiar at small cost of trouble with all that I have achieved by active research during the course of my life." So he basically said that further research was unnecessary because obviously he was right. So let's go into what Galenic theory is. One, because it helps with the rest of the content that we have in this talk, and also because it's just weird. It's just strange to wrap your head around what Galen thought was actually going on in the human body. First off, when we eat, he thought that chyle, C-H-Y-L-E, from the food went to the liver, got turned into blood, which then washed out through all the veins from the liver all over the body. Now, it washed in kind of a wave-like motion, but there was some pumping to the heart. He did think that the heart pumped blood largely through its connection to the right ventricle, but it was kind of an ebb and flow, a back and forth, and as the blood reached the organs, it was absorbed by them, and that was that. A very small amount might overflow to the arteries, but very small, and that when impurities in the blood got to the heart, they were actually pushed into the pulmonary arteries and then to the lungs where they could be breathed out. Now, when we breathe in, that air was thought to move from the airway into the pulmonary veins and then to the heart, into the left ventricle, and that was thought to be full of blood. Oh, sorry, pardon me, full of air. Now, once we get to the left ventricle, there were thought to be pores in the right ventricle that let blood seep through, and when that blood hit air, it became vital spirit or vital pneuma, and that's what traveled in the arteries. And then at the base of our brain was a structure Galen said was called the miraculous net, the rete mirabile. And it turned that vital spirit into animal or animating spirit, and that's the stuff that got pumped out through all of our nerves and caused the muscles to inflate. So that rete mirabile was the keystone of his theory that actually allowed us to explain motion. So a little bit wacky. Here's the problem. That theory stuck around for a very long time. Now, why was that the case? Well, one, Galen was very well respected during his time, and his teachings were very widespread, translated very widely. And he saw that the body was the creation of an entity called the demiurge. Now, I put omnipotent here, but the demiurge in Greek thinking really was not God with the capital G that we would think of now, and would become more prominent with later monotheistic religions that would come to Europe and the Middle East. The demiurge was basically the craftsman of the gods in ancient Greece and Rome, and that was the entity that created the body with imperfect matter based on perfect forms, aka Plato. So his writings were very widely available, translated all over, and his results were the focus rather than his experiments and the way that he got about coming to his results, because it was just easy for people to just focus on that. So his mistakes and medical theory basically remained intact and unmodified and unelaborated on for nearly 1,300 years. Now, obviously, there were some things that changed and some research done, but it was an incredibly static period of over a millennia. And for anyone who's a history buff, I just want to kind of blow your mind. Here are some of the things that occurred between Galen's elaboration of his theme and the eventual downfall of humoral theory in Galenic medicine. So the Roman Empire, Anglo-Saxons invade Britain, the Muslim conquest of Spain, Constantine moves from Rome to Constantinople, the city he created in Asia Minor. The Western Roman Empire falls. Charlemagne is the Holy Roman Emperor. Vikings start raiding all throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Magna Carta limits the British Crown's authority. The Crusades, lots of crusades, are launched from Europe into the Middle East. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople falls. The New World, quote-unquote, discovered, and the Reconquista of Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella occurs. And then the Protestant Reformation sweeps Northern Europe. And then eventually we get to the Renaissance and Enlightenment. 1,300 years, medicine more or less stagnant that whole time. And when Galen's authority was eventually taken down, it was because people started doing experiments again and looking for how results were made rather than just focusing on authority alone. Now, after the Roman Empire fell in the West and everything shifted to Constantinople, around 500 and 600 AD, we have the Muslim empires in Damascus and then Baghdad. Yeah, I believe Damascus came first, then Baghdad. And the Western literature of the Greeks and Romans was largely transferred to those places, translated from Greek into Latin and then into Arabic. And this resulted in the maintenance of that Western scientific tradition, along with a lot of interesting research in pharmacy, chemistry, astronomy and physics, mathematics, and especially optics in the Islamic empires. But very little anatomical and surgical knowledge was discovered except for the eye. Now, it was thought that physicians, or really no one, was allowed to, quote unquote, mutilate a body. So dissection and surgery were very much restricted from actually entering the body. But doing eye surgery, where you would move the lens or you would deal with some opacities, was allowed. And since you weren't able to enter the body with a knife, cautery was something that developed pretty high level in the Islamic empires. And there's quite a bit of work that's been done on how cataracts were dealt with in the Islamic empires by using a syringe to move the lens out of the way. So you had a lens that was completely clouded, you push it out of the way. Well, you still can't see perfectly or focus, but you can see something as opposed to nothing. So let's go over some of the physicians in the Islamic empires who contributed and then became high status thinkers in medieval and later Renaissance Europe. So, Razis, or Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zachariah al-Razi, was basically a Persian-born physician, and he took the humoral theory and tried to apply it to distinguish different diseases from each other. Now, if you take away all of our current understanding of what disease classification is, it's actually pretty hard. A lot of diseases cause fever. A lot of diseases cause vomiting or diarrhea. Are they all one disease? Are they different diseases? That classification and distinction making was really brought to a high degree at this time by people like Razis. He also did a lot of work in alchemy and extracting and distilling things from botanical and other sources. I'm going to talk more about this when we talk about treatment next time. Religiously, he actually was fairly radical. He doubted Galen and the humoral theory, although he was willing to work within that to explain things, but he never really thought that it explained everything as much as it should. And his willingness to disagree with authority got him into some trouble because he was actually beaten fairly severely and nearly blinded when a local imam took issue with some of the things that he was researching. Now next we have Ibn al-Haytham, which was shortened in Europe to al-Hazan, and he was in Arabia but then shifted to Cairo, and basically he and another physician named Ibn al-Nafis were working on the optics and the mathematics of how the eye works and how the lens and retina actually are able to translate light into vision. Now, at the time, the most popular theory was called the extramissive theory of vision. And if you can think about Superman shooting heat beams out of his eyes, you've basically got the idea of what extramissive vision is. The idea was that our eyes were constantly shooting beams out that would bounce off things and bounce back, kind of like radar, and that was how we saw. He basically thought that intramissive vision made way more sense, that light was going to our eyes and our eyes were receptive to that light. He also had this crazy idea that hypotheses should be proven with experimental or mathematical evidence before being accepted. So if that sounds familiar to you, you can thank al-Hazan for really kind of pushing that idea forward. Next up, a very famous physician was Avicenna, who was also Persian but traveled all over the place. He was very much a Platonist. He really did not care for Aristotle's treatment. He thought that Platonic philosophy was more in keeping with his Islamic faith, as well as explaining the world around him. So he was not well thought of in that he was transmitting the ancient Greek and Roman thinkers to contemporary audiences, but he saw himself as being of service to the world by doing so and linking Platonic philosophy to the Islamic faith. He also wrote a massive book called the Canon of Medicine that was used until roughly the 1700s because it was just so comprehensive and worked on so many different topics. Now, one thing about these massive works that last a long time, it's not that they have to be right about everything, but after a while, a lot of discussion builds up around them. And the commentary that builds up around these things becomes even more valuable sometimes than the original contribution in the book itself. That's one reason some of these texts seem to last hundreds upon hundreds of years. Now, as a recent textbook author, though, I'm really hoping mine might somehow last 500-600 years. That would be a blast. Royalties might not be rolling in that long, but one can hope. Now, one thing I'd like to draw attention to is that he was a very strong proponent of what was called the miasma theory of disease, that bad air would actually cause disease. And being around the Mediterranean world at this time, you could have people become sick and link it to bad air. And in fact, some diseases were considered to be caused by bad air, even when it's been proven that they weren't. For example, we now know that malaria is caused by mosquitoes infecting us, but the name malaria, mal-area, actually literally comes from bad air in Latin. So that idea, that miasma theory, stuck around for a while, and we're going to revisit it many times. Next up, we have Averroes, who was actually, once again, in that picture of the School of Athens by Raphael. So he was a judge and physician in Spain and was very much in the Aristotle camp, didn't really care for Avicenna and Plato, but he also integrated Galen and Aristotle. So he was linking Galen to yet another Greek philosopher. And this is what became really the seed for Aristotelian revival in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages in Europe, when things got going again, really linked into Aristotle and took his writings as very definitive, and along with him came Averroes and Galen. I think last right now we've got Ibn al-Nafis, who was in Damascus but moved to Egypt. He did a lot of work on a lot of different things, but I'd like to focus on his work on optics in the eye. So he worked to develop that intramissive theory of disease, of vision, develop optics, And he actually did a lot of things that are really ahead of the time than we might expect. He described pulmonary circulation, although that was later lost. He even theorized there was a connection between the arteries and the veins in the lung that would allow that gas exchange to happen. He did a lot of research on Galen, knew that there were things that were wrong with his writings, like the idea that there were these pores that would allow blood to travel between the right and left parts of the ventricles. And so he knew there were problems. And it's actually theorized that he did some human dissection despite the fact that was frowned upon culturally at the time. Now, I love this particular quote of his, is that we shall rely necessarily on verified examinations and straightforward research, disregarding whether our opinions will agree or disagree with those of our predecessors. Now, this just blows my mind. This is, otherwise stated, a scientific method in embryo. It's almost there. So we were very nearly at the onset of a new scientific revolution in the 1200s. So what happened? The Mongols happened. So 1258, the Mongols came through, wiped out Damascus, wiped out Baghdad. In addition to the rivers running red with blood, at times it was said that the rivers ran black with the ink of all the documents that were being disgorged from the Beit al-Hikmal, the House of Wisdom, where scholars would research and write. And so a lot of knowledge was lost as the Mongol invasions took out Baghdad and Damascus. But a lot of the scholars from Baghdad and Damascus fled west and into Europe. And so they fled from Baghdad and Damascus, and later, quite a bit later, Constantinople when it fell, and they were able to actually find a relatively comfortable berth in a brand new feature of European life, the university. Now, the history of universities is pretty complex. They used to be just settlements around individual scholars, but pretty soon, larger cities like Salerno, Bologna, Montpellier, Paris, and Padua in Italy were very much prestigious centers of the major professions, which were theology, law, and medicine. Now, I'm getting a little lonely, so I'm going to look at the chat. I want you guys to tell me, between theology, law, and medicine, who was on the bottom rung? Yep, no shock. You guys got it. Medicine got the short end. So, sorry. Medicine was not considered to be anywhere near as prestigious as theology or law, but the practice of all three of them had one thing very much in common, and it's very much evident in these illustrations. It was all text. It was very much about that definitive, authoritative knowledge based around who you were reading rather than what you were doing or observing. So knowledge of the body itself was very primitive, and dissection, interestingly, was not prohibited, but it was not encouraged. There had been earlier crusaders who had boiled the bodies of the dead crusaders to ship their bones home, because that was much easier than shipping a whole body home, which would rot. But that was actually discouraged, and some places took that prohibition of boiling the bodies of the crusaders to return home as a prohibition against dissection. But in the 1400s, Pope Sixtus IV did state in a bull that it was all right to dissect executed criminals, and human dissections once or twice a year were done at many universities. Now, because this was pre-embalming, these courses were held during the cold months, and it started with the organs, which would rot more quickly, and ended on the limbs, very much the opposite of the way we do things now with better preservation techniques. Here's the thing, though. These dissections were not there for the students to observe with their own eyes something new and interesting. They were there to nail home that Galen was right. They were basically there to showcase how right Galen was. And even the anatomists who did the dissecting didn't really look for any discrepancies, because why would you? You knew Galen was right about everything, so why bother trying to look for anything that didn't accord with what you were already expecting to see? So at this point, we have multiple people involved in the process, and the fact that we don't want to have the different people touching the body. The higher status you are, the less touching of the body you are going to be doing. You actually have three people doing the job: the professor, sits up in this pulpit and professes, reading from a text, probably not even looking at the body as he drones on through the entire Galenic text. Meanwhile, there's an instructor. The instructor's a little less prestigious, but he still doesn't have to touch the body. He has a stick that he points at the body with to underscore what the professor is saying. And finally, you have a sector, or a barber or a butcher, who's actually doing the cutting, doing the work. So remember that Greek displacement of manual labor from intellectual pursuit is very much evident in how these medieval dissections were done. And these demonstrations were open to the public, and they could be actually fairly rowdy. There's duels that were said to have happened during them, food fights during the anatomy displays. Insults between students of different nations were held in these very high oval spectator booths right there. Now, dissection, unlike these days where it's an act of generosity by the donor, is seen as a punishment for executed criminals. It was seen as something that would make it harder for them to be whole come Judgment Day. And the universities would actually discuss with the law in the town when the execution should be held so they could coincide with the demonstrations. So sometimes they tried to bring an air of dignity to it. In fact, at Padua, a guy named Fabricius, one of the famous anatomists there, would have some music play, and he'd enter the anatomical theater with a flourish of his purple and gold robes, which is yet again another career highlight I have not yet met. So we'll see if I can get that happening before my retirement. Now, in addition to medicine, in addition to the physicians at the schools and universities, the other people who were allowed to conduct dissections were artists. And this was because it was felt that the artist needed to be able to represent the human body accurately. As we move from the late medieval period into the Renaissance, that idea of extreme realism and accuracy in portraying the human body was very important. Two of the big names in this would be Leonardo da Vinci, I think you've probably heard of him, and Michelangelo Buonarroti. So this is the Pieta by Michelangelo, and the anatomical realism that was brought to these statues and paintings was largely because these artists knew how the muscles attach to the bone and how they changed their appearance during exertion and when they were at rest, etc. Now, one of my favorite stories related to this is that when Michelangelo was 17, he had to sneak out of his house to go dissect donors, or not donors at this point, pardon me, cadavers at a hospital. He'd agreed to carve a crucifix for the altar in the hospital chapel, and he was allowed to dissect deceased patients as a result of that to get better at it. Now, his father did not want him to be an artist. It was a very low status career. So at one point he got caught coming home after dissecting, and instead of telling his father he'd been dissecting to study art, he said that he'd been out chasing loose women and drinking all night. He still got a good smack for it, but that was seen as preferable. So he dissected throughout his career, and he put it to a lot of use in the carving, like the Pieta on the last slide. And there's currently a lot of articles going on about how Michelangelo actually hid human anatomy in his various paintings. So take a look here, Adam and God right there. Interesting. All right. So Leonardo da Vinci was very, very meticulous in doing dissections and recording them in detail. And it just blows my mind that anyone in the 1400s was drawing these cross-sected cuts through the skull, looking at cross-sections of the leg to see the muscles that were present there. And he actually was working with a doctor to generate an atlas of anatomy in that time. But Leonardo was very prone to starting things and not finishing them. So he got distracted by other things, largely making military things for Ludovico Sforza in Milan, and then later moving to to France. And his works on anatomy were very widely dispersed, and his groundbreaking research was not recognized at the time and wasn't even found until much later, when those discoveries had largely become redundant. And the person who made them redundant is our first modern anatomist, Andreas Vesalius. So in the 1500s, Da Vinci was unable to complete his anatomical works. So here's the guy who is now known as the father of anatomy. He was the son of a physician, and he lived outside of Brussels. And every day he would go from his house to Brussels and back, and he'd pass the hanging ground. Now, at the time, the practice there was to leave the criminals hanging from the noose until they just decayed to nothing and just kind of fell apart. He would see the organs, he would see the bones and the ligaments, he would even steal some of the limbs to try to see how they were connected, how the muscles were attached, where the ligaments were. And he then studied medicine at Leuven, Paris, and then moved on to Padua, which is in Italy, not too far away from Venice. So Vesalius in Padua did something I think is also amazing. He graduated as a medical student and was immediately named chair of surgery and anatomy at his alma mater as soon as he graduated. So if any of you guys want to equal that and get hired on as faculty before you've even done a residency, I'll give you a big thumbs up for that. Now, he did not like the way he'd been taught anatomy. He didn't like the physician and the professor droning on and on while someone else cut, someone else pointed. So he acted as lector, ostensor, and sector. He did the lecturing, he did the pointing, and he did the cutting in front of his students. He'd have a skeleton that he'd articulated with him, probably gathered from the remains of criminals who he'd pulled the skeletons down outside of Brussels. And he was very much someone who worked with his hands and saw that as something that was useful, bringing a very Northern European manual work ethic to this that is going to be in contrast to the Greek ideal of not having manual labor interfere with your intellectual exercise. And I just like that he was unfond of doctors who despised the work of the hand. So his dissections and his work convinced him that Galen was just wrong about lots of things, and they were not minor errors. The skeletal details and the muscle attachments were all wrong. Blood cannot move from the right ventricle to the left, and humans have no rete mirabile, that thing that turns that vital spirit into animal or animating spirit. It doesn't exist, and it's the keystone for Galenic physiology. So what's going on? Eventually, he figured out why there were so many errors, is that Galen never dissected a human. He only dissected what are called Barbary apes and monkeys. So Vesalius basically said that Galen was misled by his monkeys, and all of the errors that had accumulated since then. Now, Vesalius did share Galen's propensity for kind of self-importance and not suffering fools gladly, and he alienated himself from his colleagues at Padua, who were all devoted Galenists. He was basically a Galenic heretic to them. He got upset with them for being so stubborn, burned a lot of his notes, and became court physician to Emperor Charles V and his son Philip II in Spain. Now, he grew to be fairly disillusioned with that, took a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, but died when he came back and was died on the Greek island of Zakynthos. Now, my wife and her two of her childhood friends did a Greek island getaway, kind of girls' massive fun vacation a couple of years ago. And I was like, oh, that's great. Where do I to take you these days? And she's, oh, we went to this great Greek island called Zakynthos. And I was like, oh, you're in the one place I want to be an anatomy nerd more than anything. So she looked for this statue, didn't actually find it, but there is a statue there marking Vesalius and his death on the island of Zakynthos. So I'll get rolling on the GoFundMe for send a Dr. Ward to a Greek beach island sometime in the near future. All right, so let's talk about why Vesalius actually mattered. In addition to pointing out the errors of Galen, is that he wanted anatomy to be a visual art. So this is what anatomical illustration was largely like before Vesalius. Here's an Avicenna-based makeup of the skeleton. I mean, yeah, it looks skeleton-ish. I don't know what's going on with that calcaneus here. It kind of looks like an axe. The humeral head is kind of in a negative space here, kind of weird. Here's another one, not too far before Vesalius, just about 50 years prior. And I just don't even know where to start with this. I mean, there's the heart kind of way over to the left here. And I think that's supposed to be the liver. Oh, somebody's unmuted, just so you know. And the intestines are just going every which way. I just don't even know where to begin. Let's contrast that with the work in Vesalius's work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica. So these cuttings, these woodcuts, were made by a student of Titian's who was in Venice, a guy named Stephen von Calcar. He sadly died young, but these are the illustrations that Vesalius brought to it. Is that a turkey as a model? That would make more sense to me than some of the other things that would explain how this actually works. So yeah, but if you take a look at these Vesalian drawings, now there are errors in Vesalius. He didn't get everything right. He didn't dissect a large enough number of bodies to get everything right. But his illustrations in this book are phenomenal. If I had to, I could teach from this 500-year-old book, nearly 600, well, yeah, about 500-year-old book. So it was a massive step forward in terms of realism and what the human body actually looks like. Now, let's just take a quick aside for me. What was my best day ever? Was it my graduation, getting my PhD? That was a great day. Was it shortly thereafter when my wife and I got married? Oh, look how young I am. Or was it 7 years ago when my children were born? Oh, all great days. Or was it the day I got to personally inspect a copy at Ohio State University of De Humani Corpora Fabrica? I'm going to wisely not answer that question and just say those were all great days. All right, we're going to finish up this talk by talking about one last person who brings us to the basic late Renaissance, early Enlightenment era, and that's William Harvey. William Harvey was an Englishman, but he studied at Padua and actually was the head of the English contingent of students there. He studied anatomy and began doing his own medical investigations. Now, Vesalius alienated his colleagues at Padua, but the cat was out of the bag. People knew that his work was clearly something that had to be taken account of. So William Harvey developed and really kept that experimental mindset throughout his life. He became returned to England, became physician in ordinary to King Charles I, which gave him a lot of things and a lot of access to resources that made his research easier. But during the English Civil War, it made things a little more difficult, and he actually had to dodge various factions in the English Civil War. Now, he didn't think that the Galenic account of how blood works made any kind of sense at all. And there's no evidence that he was aware of Ibn al-Nafis, who then had described pulmonary circulation before. So William Harvey's method of trying to figure out how the blood actually flows was to tie off the pulmonary artery and insert a tube into the right ventricle. And he pumped water into it, and he just pushed and pushed and pushed until it was just about to burst. And no matter how much fluid he pumped into that right ventricle, none of it came through the septum into the left ventricle. There was no pores, there was no transfer of blood between the ventricles. So only removal of that ligature let the pressure go and let blood move from the right side through the pulmonary artery to the lungs and back to the left side thereafter. So that was more or less how he came up with the idea of the pulmonary circulation. He also did the first quantitative study in medical history. So next time you guys are looking at those physiologic calculations, these equations are playing into cardiac physiology, you can shake your fist to the sky and curse William Harvey for bringing math to medicine in the first place. But it's kind of a neat study. He basically thought that if Galen was correct, the liver was making blood from food, that blood was washing out over the organs, and there was no return for that blood. And it was really not coming from anywhere. Galen never really said if it was recycled in any way. And so if Galen was correct, we had to create about 540 pounds of blood every day to replace it as it got washed into the organs and then lost somehow. So that made no sense. And he thought that blood circulating was far more sensible and hypothesized that there were tiny vessels that we couldn't see that connected the arteries and the veins. And these were, of course, capillaries, which were later discovered but had to be hypothesized by Harvey. He noted that the valves in the veins only allowed one-way flow. How many millennia had people been doing bleeding and cutting into veins to bleed people, but not notice really that the veins were really a way of regulating the flow of blood one direction and not allowing it the other. And one way he was able to figure out how the heartbeat actually occurred and how the atria and ventricles work coordinated was by taking cold-blooded animals like lizards and snakes and then freezing them, making them cool down before doing a vivisection and actually seeing the heartbeat slow enough that he could figure out how those contractions occurred and what steps preceded other steps. So that's William Harvey. And that is going to take us to the end of tonight's talk. So we've got a starting point, and we're going to be returning to various topics in the ancient, medieval, and Renaissance period as we go into other topics in this series. But this gives us a foundation from which to work from regarding humoral theory and the very beginning of descriptive anatomy, which will lead to improvements in surgery and investigations in the body. So next week, I think same time, we're going to be looking at concepts of health and disease and basically leading to modern pathology. So what is health? What is disease according to ancient, medieval, and then modern thinkers, and how do those transitions occur? All right, that is it for tonight. That'll be November 13th. Does anyone have any questions? At this point, feel free to unmute yourselves if you just want to say anything, or feel free to use the chat as well. Or if you just want to go home and have some dinner, that would also be fine. Oh, yes. Thank you, Sean. Oh, and thank you guys very much. So essentially, one thing that we're doing with the certificate situation here is in previous years, if you attend, what happens is if you attend all of these sessions, you can get a little certificate that has your name on it, says you're a scholar of medical history, according to us, signed by me and Sean. And essentially, to do that, just attend all these sessions, take the test that will be available to you shortly. Sean or Priyanka will make sure that you guys get the link to that. The questions are not intended to be very difficult. We'll see how that goes. And it's just a way for us to make sure that those who are attending are paying attention. If for some reason you take the test and you just don't happen to get above a 70, let me know and we can have you do the makeup exercise where you write a short 1 to 2 page little paper on some aspect of the talk or some related topic of interest. Yep, and Sean's got the quiz link in the chat, so make sure you guys follow that if you go. Oh, thank you guys very much. Look at all these thank yous. And I appreciate it very much, but I love talking about this topic, so obviously it's just a treat for me to actually have an audience to expound at, so I greatly appreciate it from both sides. It's a win-win situation. All right, I will see you guys. Well, first years, I'll see you on Tuesday, and everybody else, hopefully I'll see you here 1 week from tonight at 5 p.m. Catch you later. Oh, thanks. Still recording. Yes, let me fix that. All right, have a great night, everybody.
Hey, Dr. Ward, you still there? Dr. Ward.